The first thing you need to know is that nobody saw her name badge until it was too late to pretend they'd treated her fairly. Her name was Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, though she hadn't used that title in nearly 4 years, and on the morning shift at Mercy Central Medical, she was simply Nurse Vasquez. New transfer, quiet, lightly older than the other RNs, assigned to the ER because the unit director, Dr. Marcus Holt, had asked for warm bodies with licenses, not warm bodies with opinions. She arrived at 0545, as she always arrived, ahead of the scheduled hour, badge already clipped, hair already back, shoes already tied in the double knot that takes an extra 4 seconds but never comes loose. Nobody noticed the double knot. The morning charge nurse, a brisk woman named Tanya Kowalski, handed her a clipboard with a smile that lived entirely above the upper lip. You'll be handling bed cleanup between discharges, intake paperwork for walk-ins, and vital checks on the secondary ward, Tanya said, not looking up from her own chart. The docs don't want floaters in the trauma bays unless called. Vasquez said, understood, and went to work. That was the whole conversation. That was her orientation to Mercy Central ER, 4 sentences and a clipboard. 3 weeks into her transfer, nobody had asked where she came from or what she'd done before nursing school. The assumption, when people bothered to form one, was somewhere unremarkable, a rural clinic maybe, a quiet urgent care. She didn't correct this. She drank bad coffee from the break room, refilled supply carts without being asked, and answered every call light in her zone before anyone else had processed that it had sounded. The ER staff ran like most urban emergency departments, organized on the surface, tribal underneath. There were the attending physicians who owned the trauma bays. There were the senior nurses who owned the attending physician's tolerance. There were the residents who owned nothing but ambition, and there were the floaters and transfers and per diems who were essentially furniture that breathed. Vasquez was furniture. She knew it. She filed that information the way she filed most discomforts, categorized, deprioritized, stored somewhere below the functional threshold of concern. There was, however, one person who had looked at her twice. His name was Rafael Garza. He was a surgical tech, mid-30s, former Army medic who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before coming home and building a different life inside a different kind of organized chaos. He'd caught something in Vasquez's posture during her first week, not anything dramatic, not a scar or a lapel pin or a veterans organization lanyard, something quieter than that, the way she positioned herself in a room, the slight leftward lean when she stood near a doorway, the way her eyes swept corners. These were not things a person does consciously after enough years of being somewhere very loud. They were remnants. Garza hadn't said anything. He just started watching. On the morning of October 14th at 7:22 a.m., the trauma radio came alive with the kind of static that meant the dispatcher was speaking too fast. Multi-vehicle pileup, Interstate 90 westbound at mile marker 44. Semi versus passenger vehicles. 11 confirmed casualties, 4 critical. Multiple ambulances en route. Estimated ETA to Mercy Central for the first incoming 4 minutes. Dr. Tommy. Marcus Holt was the attending on duty. He was 47, board certified in emergency medicine, and he was good, genuinely good, the kind of good that comes from volume and speed and 1,000 fast decisions mostly right. But he was also, in the specific way of people who have been good at something for a long time in a single institution, accustomed to a particular hierarchy of who mattered in a room. Bay 1, Bay 2, Bay 3, he said, moving fast. Tanya, I want senior staff only in the primary bays. Pull whoever you've got. Tanya began directing bodies. Vasquez stepped forward, not urgently, not with her hand raised, just moved toward Bay 2 the way water moves toward a lower elevation. Not you, Tanya said without cruelty. I need you on intake paperwork for incoming ambulatory cases. Secondary desk. Vasquez stopped, nodded, went to the secondary desk. The first gurney came in at 726, the second came at 729. Young woman, lacerations stabilized in the field. The third came at 7,034, and the paramedic running alongside it, a big man named Okafor, 10 years in the field. Not a man who frightened easily, was running faster than Vasquez had seen a paramedic run in 3 weeks at Mercy Central. That was the first indicator. Okafor's pace, not his voice, not the equipment, not the monitor reading, his pace. The patient on that gurney was a man in his mid-40s. He was still wearing what was left of a flannel shirt, one sleeve gone, the other pressed against his upper thorax by a field dressing that had soaked through to the third layer. His blood pressure, Okafor called out, was 74 over palp. His pulse was 134 and thready. His left lung was diminished on auscultation in the field. He had been conscious at scene, barely, and he had said, this was the detail Okafor relayed almost as an afterthought, focused on the clinical data. He had said, tell them 8112. Nobody in the receiving bay knew what that meant. Vasquez, sitting at the secondary desk 20 feet away, heard it. She was on her feet before she understood she was standing. Later, Garza would say he saw her face change. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in films, with a widening of the eyes and a sharp intake of breath. More like a thermostat clicking on, a quiet transition from one operational state to another. She was already crossing the floor when Dr. Holt's team began working the patient in Bay 2. The attending resident, Dr. Priya Mehta, was calling out the patient's stats: BP plummeting, suspected hemothorax, tension pneumothorax presentation on the left. The patient needed a chest tube immediately. She was preparing for it. She was moving through the correct procedure. She was also moving at the pace of someone who had done this in simulation far more often than in reality, and the patient was at 68 over palp, now pulse 148. And every second of hesitation was a specific and measurable cost. Vasquez arrived at the bay entrance. Back on intake, Tanya said, appearing beside her. He's tensioning, Vasquez said, quietly, not a shout. His trachea is deviating, left. You can see it from here. Tanya looked. She could not, in fact, see it from there. Not because it wasn't there, but because she hadn't been trained to see it at 6 feet with a patient in motion. Dr. Mehta has it handled. She's prepping for a tube. There's no time for a tube. He needs a needle decompression in the next 90 seconds. That is not your call. Vasquez looked at her. Something passed through that look, not anger, not condescension, something more like a precise measurement of available time versus available bureaucracy. She stepped past Tanya into the bay. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no announcement. She simply appeared at the left side of the gurney, snapped on a glove with the particular motion of someone whose hands had done this thousands of times, and said, to no one, specifically to the room, to the physics of the situation, 14 gauge, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, now. Dr. Mehta looked up. Her face cycled through approximately 4 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds. Vasquez didn't wait for the fifth. She turned to the crash cart, found the needle she needed, not by searching, but by knowing exactly where it was, because she had reorganized that cart on her first day as a quiet act of professional habit, and she was already moving back to the patient when Dr. The Time, Holt, walked into the bay. What followed was approximately 90 seconds of 2 parallel conversations running simultaneously. In the first conversation, Dr. Saish and Dr. Say. Holt, in a controlled but distinctly cold voice, told Vasquez that she had no authorization to be in this bay, that she was a transfer nurse who had been explicitly excluded from trauma procedures, and that if she didn't step back, he would have her badge pulled before the shift ended. In the second conversation, Vasquez's hands performed a needle thoracocentesis, clean entry, correct angle, 2-finger stabilization, confident advance until air hissed from the chest of the man from the 812, like something escaping that had been trapped too long. His blood pressure, read out by a stunned Dr. Mehta 30 seconds later, was 88 over 60 and climbing. Both conversations finished at roughly the same time. Holt was staring at the monitor. Mehta was staring at Vasquez's hands. The patient, who had been gray-white, the color of old concrete, was beginning to pink at the lips. Vasquez peeled the glove off her right hand. He'll need a formal tube once he's stable, she said to Mehta professionally, as though they were colleagues of equal standing in a quiet consultation. His left thorax is going to need imaging when you can move him. Watch his pressure. He might be bleeding somewhere below the field dressing that the paramedics couldn't access in the field. She looked at Holt. I'll go back to the secondary desk. She left the bay. Holt turned to Tanya. Who the hell is she? Transfer, Tanya said. 3 weeks. She's been doing discharge paperwork. The scold came 7 minutes later, in the hallway between the bay and the nursing station, in front of 6 staff members and a paramedic who hadn't left yet. Doctor. Holt was not cruel about it, but he was thorough and he was public. And there was something particular in the way he chose to conduct it in the corridor, the choice of venue for a correction that could have happened in a closed office, that said more about him than the words did. He told her she had violated protocol, that she had performed an invasive procedure without authorization, that regardless of the outcome, the liability implications were significant, that if she had misread the situation, if the tracheal deviation had been an artifact of positioning rather than tension pneumothorax, the patient could have suffered additional injury. He told her that competence didn't grant license, that the hospital had procedures for reasons, that she needed to understand that the primary bays were not for floaters, Vasquez said. The word dropped into the hallway like something solid. Holt paused. I wasn't going to say that. I know, she said. I said it because it's accurate. She looked at him without anger, without the slight upward cant of a person waiting for an apology. She looked at him the way she had looked at the ceiling of many rooms in many places where waiting for someone else to do the right thing was not an option the situation was offering. The patient is alive. I have to get back to the secondary desk. She turned, walked away. The paramedic, Okafor, was watching. He looked at Dr. Holt. Then he looked at the hallway where Vasquez had gone. Something was working behind his eyes, some private calculation that had been running since the moment his patient whispered 812th into the wind-stripped wreck of a freeway. He pulled out his phone. Garza, stationed near the supply room, watched Okafor dial a number, speak quietly for about 45 seconds, and then stand very still, holding the phone to his ear with an expression that belonged on someone who had just been told something large. At 9:17 a.m., 1 hour and 43 minutes after the first gurney had come through the bay doors, the hospital intercom crackled. Security to the rooftop access corridor. Rooftop access corridor. Nobody thought much of it. Hospitals have intercom noise, the way rivers have current. Constant, directional, unremarkable to anyone who works there long enough. The sound that came 12 minutes later was not unremarkable. It was the sound of rotors. Not a medical helicopter. Mercy Central's medevac pad was on the east roof, and that aircraft had a lighter signature, a familiar pattern the staff recognized the way commuters recognize their train. This was something heavier, faster, a sound that pressed itself against the building from the outside and found the windows and asked them questions. Tanya looked up from her station. Meta walked out of the bay. Holt stopped mid-sentence to a resident. The rooftop access door at the end of the ER corridor. A door that led to a service elevator that nobody used except maintenance and the occasional misguided family trying to find a view, opened. 4 people came through it. They were in civilian clothes. They moved the way civilians do not move. One of them, the first through the door, a compact woman with a short-cropped haircut and the kind of eyes that did continuous environmental assessment without appearing to, scanned the ER in 4 seconds and said, in a voice that was not loud but carried perfectly, I'm looking for a nurse, Elena Vasquez. The ER staff did not freeze exactly. They did the thing that people do when authority enters a room, and the authority is of an unrecognized and therefore disorienting type. They paused in the specific way of people who aren't sure what social protocol applies. Garza, standing near the supply room, felt something settle in his chest, the recognition of a long-forming suspicion arriving at confirmation. Okafor pointed. Secondary desk. Vasquez heard her name. She stood, already fully composed, because whatever internal transition had been required had happened sometime between needle decompression and the corridor lecture, and she had completed it without anyone watching. She walked toward the woman from the rooftop door. They looked at each other for a moment. Chief, the woman said, not to introduce a concept, to identify a person. Behind her, one of the other 3, a man who was built the way load-bearing structures are built, practically with no aesthetic concession, pressed his mouth briefly and looked at the floor. And anyone reading that as neutral stillness had not spent time around people trying to hold themselves together. Sergeant Torres, Vasquez said, you didn't have to come yourself. Sergeant Delgado asked for you specifically, Torres said. We figured the request should come in person. The bay where the patient from the 812th was stabilizing was 12 feet to the left. He was intubated now, on pressors, but his blood pressure had been holding at 106 systolic for the last 30 minutes. He was not supposed to be conscious. He was, however, alert in the way that certain people are alert even through chemical interference. Alert in the bone, in the muscle memory, in whatever part of the brain keeps count of who is in a room. Torres walked to the bay, stood in the doorway, looked at the man in the bed. He couldn't speak. The tube prevented it, but his eyes found Vasquez where she stood behind Torres, and something crossed his face that had nothing to do with vital signs. "He's been stable since," Dr. Mehta began. "Since she decompressed his chest," Torres said. Not to correct anyone, just to note it accurately. Holt was there now. The hallway's full complement of available staff had found reasons to be present without appearing to be present. The universal behavior of people who know something important is happening in a shared space and have not been officially invited but cannot leave. Torres turned to face the room, not aggressively, not theatrically. She turned the way a person turns when they have a clear statement to make to a clear audience. Elena Vasquez served as senior combat medic with the 812th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Torres said. She completed 6 combat deployments. She ran combat casualty care on 12 medevac extractions in active hostile environments. After our unit's last classified operation, she separated from service and requested no public acknowledgement of her record. A brief pause. The weight of the following sentence appeared to arrive before it did. She saved 4 members of our unit in the field, in circumstances that most of us would not have survived long enough to describe. We have been asked by Sergeant Delgado to make sure that anyone responsible for her care here understands who they're working with. The hallway held 17 people. 17 people who in the preceding 3 weeks had handed her discharge paperwork and restricted her from trauma bays and listened to her be corrected in a public corridor. Not one of them spoke. Torres looked at Holt specifically, not with animosity, not with the punishing pleasure of a reversal, but with the direct, exhausted honesty of someone who has stood over too many bodies to find institutional ego particularly interesting. "I understand there was a question about authorization today," she said. Holt's expression moved through several countries without settling in any of them. Vasquez touched Torres's arm lightly. "It's a good hospital," she said, and she meant it. That was what none of them could quite process. That she meant it, that there was no current of blame running beneath the statement. That she had worked her shift and done what needed doing and was now standing here like a person who had never required the hallway's understanding in order to know exactly what she was worth. But there was something else in that moment, something that the adrenaline of the reveal had not yet allowed the room to see. It was in the slight tightening around Vasquez's eyes when she looked at Torres. The particular restraint of someone managing an emotion that has been managed for a very long time through very particular conditions and is now being asked to be managed in a new and unexpected kind of room. Garza saw it. He was the only one who did. Later, after Torres and her team had returned to the rooftop after Delgado had been transferred to the surgical floor, after the shift had technically resumed its normal shape around the wound left by the morning's events, Garza found Vasquez at the supply cart. She was restocking gauze, not because it needed restocking urgently, because her hands needed something ordinary. 2 tours, he said. 6, she said. He nodded. He had known it was more than 2. 8/112 is heavy. It was, she said. She placed a roll of gauze in its slot with absolute precision. It was a lot of things. He understood what she meant. He had his own drawer of things that had been a lot. "You could have said something," he offered, "when they were assigning you to discharge paperwork." "I know," she said. She didn't say more than that, and he didn't push, because the answer was obvious to anyone who had tried to go somewhere quiet after somewhere loud. She hadn't come to Mercy Central ER to be a legend. She had come to do work with her hands, at a manageable volume, in a place where nobody would ask her to carry the weight of what she'd already carried. The secondary desk and the discharge clipboard were not humiliations to her. They were a particular kind of rest. The fact that the rest had been interrupted was not anyone's fault, really. The fact that a man with her unit's number on his lips had come through those doors was not the hospital's fault. The fact that she had done what had needed doing and then stood in the hallway and accepted a procedural correction in front of 17 people without speaking above a measured tone, that was not sainthood. That was the specific kind of fatigue that comes from having done important things in places that will never be named in any public document, and then coming home and discovering that the important things don't travel well, that they leave a residue. That the residue is not bitterness exactly, but the particular loneliness of competence that no longer needs an audience and has not yet figured out what it needs instead. Dr. Tremover. Holt found her before the end of the shift. He stood in the supply room doorway for a moment, which for a man of his particular confidence was already a significant thing. When he spoke, he was careful, in the way that careful people are careful when they know they've been exactly wrong about something and haven't fully decided how to hold that knowledge. "I'm going to put a formal note in your file," he said, amending this morning's incident. "The intervention was correct. The outcome—" He stopped, tried again. "You read the presentation before any of us did." "Before me too," Vasquez said fairly. "I just had more time to recognize it." He stood there another moment. He was a good doctor. He was also, she suspected, going to be bothered by this morning for considerably longer than the morning deserved to occupy, which was in itself a kind of information about him, that he had a conscience that did its accounting whether he authorized the audit or not. "Is there anything you want adjusted?" he asked, "in terms of your assignment here?" She thought about it. The question was genuine. She gave it the respect of genuine consideration. "The crash cart in Bay 2, she said finally. "The 14-gauge needles are in the wrong drawer. I moved them on my first day, but someone moved them back. If they'd been where the protocol says they go, this morning would have been slower." He blinked. This was not the answer he had anticipated. "I'll make sure it's corrected," he said. "Thank you," she said, and returned to her gauze. In the room down the hall, in a surgical bed with 2 drains and a chest tube and a blood pressure that was finally holding without mechanical insistence, Sergeant First Class Daniel Delgado was sleeping. Not the sleep of medication, the other kind. The kind that happens when you have been in danger and then you have not been, and your body takes the opportunity to run all the maintenance it deferred. On the monitor above his bed, someone had written on a post-it note, a nurse probably from the floor staff rather than the ER, a single line they thought was just a patient note, ID confirmed. Voss family contact. Nobody from the 812th would see that note and need it explained. Nobody from the 812th needed it explained that the reason Delgado had stabilized in that bay at 68 over palp and tensioning rather than in the back of an ambulance on a freeway overpass was that the one person on the floor of that hospital who could read that presentation in the first 10 seconds of arrival had been assigned to the secondary desk and had stood up anyway. The double knot in her shoes did not come loose. It never did. Some people spend years making themselves invisible in plain sight. They take the paperwork and the worst assignments and the worst shifts, and they do not flinch, and the people around them interpret the absence of flinching as absence of significance. They mistake endurance for ordinariness. They file the quiet person in the quiet corner under background and return to the center of the room where the noise is, because the noise is where they've always looked for what matters. What they miss, what almost every room misses almost every time, is that the person who has survived the loudest possible version of their own work does not need the noise. They learned what they are worth in places that didn't have time for the performance of it. And when the door finally opens and the thing that tests them walks in, they do not rise to the occasion. They were already there, standing at the secondary desk, drinking bad coffee, waiting, without waiting, for whatever came next. If a story like this leaves something in you, some particular weight you want to sit with, then stay with it a moment before you move on. That weight has a name. It's the cost of looking past the quiet ones. And the only cure for it is to look again, more carefully, starting now.